I'm Weston LaBar. Welcome to the very first episode of On the Waterfront, brought to you by Waterfront Logistics. We've got a very esteemed guest with us today, Mr. John Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Custom Policy at the National Retail Federation. He's always such a great guest to have, and especially now with so much going on as it relates to economic outlooks, new trade policies, additional tariffs coming with the new administration. We have no one better to help shed some light on what's going on and help give some insights as what people should be looking at as they continue to try to navigate the fog that is the supply chain industry in 2025 and how to respond to all sorts of things that are out of an operator's control. But John, thank you for joining us for this inaugural episode of On the Waterfront.
Hey, Weston, appreciate the invite to come and join you. I thought we were going to talk about the Eagles winning the Super Bowl this weekend. I didn't think we were going to talk about tariffs.
Well, that would be real forecasting. As you know, I'm a big believer in the Eagles. I predict a double-digit win. But being that we're recording this the week before and it will drop the week after, coming out February 12th, I didn't want to have you redo this if something went awry. But I'm here to say go Birds, that's for sure. And I feel like everybody else in the country that's not in and around the direct Kansas City area has probably got the same sentiments.
Sounds good.
But anyway, we're here to talk about the supply chain. And first, maybe give everybody a little bit of an overview. I think most of the people who've ever watched any of these interviews know what the NRF is and who you are, but maybe just give a little bit of an overview of the National Retail Federation, your members, what you do, and what you guys are looking at as big agenda items here in 2025 before we get into the nitty gritty on trade policy.
Sure, thanks. So, National Retail Federation, we're the world's largest retail trade association. We represent everybody from the small single store operators up to the large format big box stores, online chain restaurants, and everybody in between. Hopefully, some of your favorite retail stores where you shop on a regular basis. My role here at NRF, I'm on the government affairs side of the house, and I handle all of our trade, supply chain, transportation, product safety, loss prevention related issues. So it's been a busy few years, I would like to say.
Those are, if I'm thinking about retail today, and if you put me, interviewed me on the sidewalk and said, what are the three biggest issues that retailers face today? It's uh, uncertainty in the global trade markets with tariffs. Check, we got that to talk about. It is looming trade wars on multiple fronts, and how do you establish your supply chain in a way that you feel confident moving forward you can get goods to market. And then obviously theft, whether that's cybersecurity, whether that's physical theft, whether that's smash and grabs, and you're the guy that gets to cover all of it. So congratulations, John. As I said before, I think that you have the most job security in the world because you're so highly regarded and you just keep getting issues. That's how I felt at HTA. There was no shortage of reasons to have me around, and luckily Matt Schrapp's doing a great job over there now. Trying to keep all my colleagues in the drayage market operating and keeping those wheels turning. But maybe the way we start off is 2025. I know that you guys typically do your economic forecast. You're not quite complete with it yet, but talk a little bit about what you're seeing because last year what we kept hearing is, well, we're going to wait until the presidential election. Two very different philosophies throughout the campaign between the incumbent and then the incoming now administration. I think a lot of people felt like, okay, depending on how the election goes, we'll make some crucial business decisions. But now going into 2025, I think the only thing that's certain is there's uncertainty and buckle up because you still have a lot of conflicting economic indicators. You still have now the inflation, but now you have the addition of new tariffs with new countries on new products. And then on top of all of that, you've got consumer confidence that I think is taking a look at everything because when eggs are $10 a dozen, or when what you paid, uh, you know, $10 for a year ago is now $20, you start to rethink your priorities from a purchase perspective. So talk a little bit about like what you can as far as the economic prognostications for 2025, and then we can dive into some of those key indicators we're watching from the policy front. They're going to influence and shape what what our economic outlook really does look like at the end of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, look, coming out of 2024, I mean, you continue to hear about, the potential for recession. You saw inflation start to tick down. You saw some of the interest rates start to tick down. And look, retailers ended the year on a high note. I mean, we had another, really good holiday season, up over the prior year. I think coming into 2025, I think there's still expectations for another good, year in retail. As you know, we won't have our yearly forecast out for another few weeks. But I think there's a lot of questions out there about what's actually going to happen in the economy moving forwards. There was a lot of optimism at the towards the end of 2024, especially with the election. Obviously, a lot of folks were excited to have President Trump come in and believe in his policies. So you saw some high expectations of what to expect. The president ran on defeating inflation and lowering prices. So I think folks were really looking upon him to be able to deliver upon that. I think you're starting to see some confidence dip a little bit. The past two consumer confidence surveys out of the Conference Board have shown there's been a bit of a dip. And I think, as you noted, just the uncertainty about kind of what's next is challenging for businesses who are trying to plan and prepare for the next year. They're making plans now, 6, 9, 12 months in advance for kind of how they're doing their sourcing, what the products they're bringing in, where they're bringing it in from. The ongoing uncertainty about tariffs and trade wars and everything else certainly is weighing on a lot of these companies, and especially smaller businesses that don't have as much control over their supply chains as larger guys do. So, I think we're still, feeling confident about how 2025 is going to look, but we still have inflation hanging out there over us and just a lot of uncertainty. I mean, the Fed just decided not to lower interest rates, again. So that certainly has some play on, what we can be looking for in 2025.
Yeah, and it's funny because you talk about the outlook, and people are trying to do long-term planning, but don't understand what the rules will look like a year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, right? It's almost like playing football against the Chiefs. You don't know what defensive holding is or isn't from one play to the next. So I say this because when Trump was previously in office, his administration, mostly it was a China heavy uh, tariff target, right? And because of that, many of your members augmented their supply chains and they started sourcing in other places like Cambodia and Thailand, Vietnam, places that didn't have the same level of tariffs. Some still went from China, but maybe they would do some sort of a 3-2-1 tariff avoidance by shipping through Mexico or through Canada and then making that the origin. That's shifted, right? Because now we're also expanding the number of countries that we are, putting under the tariff bullseye. And many may say they think it's a negotiating tool, but the fact is that you can't um, make a business plan off of what could be
Right.
posturing for negotiations across things like drug trafficking and immigration and other things. So you've got to plan worst case scenario. On top of that, and I know this is a complex question, but on top of that, I'm talking with a lot of retailers who are doubling down again on California, but it's mostly because of the shipping rates. It is so much cheaper to ship direct from Asia to the West Coast, makes tons of sense. Are you in your discussions with members, are there concerns that now all of a sudden the supply chains they created 4 years ago to deal with the last round of tariffs is going to be a lot more difficult this time because it's not directed at one country, and some of the things that they invested in heavily like nearshoring in Mexico as a good example is not the same option it was because now they're subject to those same tariffs, and it may be even worse because they may be subject on the China side and the Mexico side depending on how creative the administration gets.
Yeah. So, a lot to unpack there, but you're absolutely right. I mean, look, when we saw the first round of the trade war back in 2018, 2019, with the focus on China with the Section 301 tariffs, you know, folks got the message to move out of China. We saw a significant shift where they shifted out, whether it's Southeast Asia, Latin America, back here to the North American region, French shore, ally shore, near shore, whatever shore you want to call it. Folks, did that and started moving around. Um, but if you listen to President Trump when he was running, he talked about tariffs as the most beautiful word in the dictionary, and his answer to solve kind of every problem. He talked about tariffs in two forms where he continuously talked about during kind of pre-election. One, kind of a universal baseline tariff. It started at 10% on everything and everyone. It bumped up to 20%. He also talked about a China-specific tariff that started at 60% and then went up to 100%. We did a study looking at those two different tariff proposals that we actually released. It turned out to be the day before the election, just by chance. But we took a look at the impact of those tariff rates on six key retail categories: apparel, footwear, home appliances, furniture, toys, and travel goods. And to no surprise, the prices went up in each one of those categories because, as we know, the tariff is a tax paid by a U.S. importer. It's not paid by the foreign company. It's not paid by the foreign government. It's paid
It's
by
really
the
paid by the
importer.
consumer.
Well, at the end of the day, yes, it is paid by the consumer because the importer will then pass on that cost. So, we found that just within those six categories alone, consumers are going to lose between 46 to 70, $78 billion worth of spending power just in those six categories. Other groups have put out other studies looking at kind of their own specific categories. You've got a number of economists and think tanks here in DC that said, the average impact to the family for the year would be between anywhere $2,500 to $7,600, again, depending upon what those tariff rates are. So, the president talked
And,
about
and
that
just to be
throughout.
clear, And just to be clear, John, that's
Yes,
because if they're buying all the same things, no differently, the costs of everything have gone up commensurate to equate for that $2,500 to $7,600 per household, depending on probably where you live, your economic status, how much money you already spend. But that's what you're talking about. If you didn't change your
correct.
spending habits whatsoever, it's just going to cost you more out of pocket in that range.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So while the president talked about those two specific tariffs throughout the campaign, post election, he started talking about a range of other tariffs that he wanted to go and put in place. He started talking about the 25 and 10% on Mexico, Canada, and China over the immigration of fentanyl issue, and we'll dive into that in a minute. He started talking about putting tariffs on the EU because they treat us so badly. Talked about 100% tariff on the BRIC countries because of currency related issues. He's talked about putting tariffs now on Denmark to take over Greenland. Who had that on their chessboard? I mean, you know, um, and just
I still
tariffs.
can't figure out if we actually changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. I saw
I
so much
think
scuttlebutt about that, but who knows?
I think Google actually changed it when you view it in the U.S., but outside the U.S., it's still the Gulf of Mexico.
Got it.
Um,
Got it.
but when you listen to the president and some of his allies talk about tariffs, there are a variety of reasons why they talk about tariffs. It's one, a negotiating tactic, and you've seen that. Look what happened with Colombia, 2 weeks ago, and the fight there over taking back the deportees. That probably could have been resolved in a phone call as opposed to over Twitter and the threat of tariffs. But we threatened 25% tariffs on Colombia. That would have been horrible for Valentine's Day with all the roses we get out of Colombia. And then we had the issue this week on Mexico, Canada, and China. Um, they talk about tariffs as a way to get companies out of China. And again, you saw that in 2018 with the trade war, with companies made that shift. There are means to get companies back to the United States for manufacturing here in the U.S. You saw a little bit of that, but you didn't see this huge flood back to the United States. And I think there's long discussion to be had about what kind of manufacturing do we actually want in the United States, and how do tariffs actually help that besides other incentives to make that happen. And then the fourth reason we keep hearing about tariffs is they're a source of revenue. You look at one of the other big priorities this year for Congress and the president, it's renewal of the tax bill, and all those provisions, especially for consumers, that are set to expire. They got to pay for that somehow, and they're looking at tariffs as a way to pay for that. The president talks about no tax on tips and everything else, and he talks about tariffs as a means to pay for that. He keeps harking on we used to fund the government through tariffs. That's not how the system works anymore, and we can't tariff ourselves
Yeah.
enough to make up for that difference.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up because when people think of tariffs, they think of the finished product and where it's coming in from, and they think, okay, well, this was made in another country, so if we make it more expensive, then we'll make it here in America, right? But there's a couple things that I think people miss out on. The first is that it's not just the finished products. You're also putting tariffs on raw materials. You're putting tariffs
Absolutely.
componentry for finished products here. And I've always said from my time at the Harbor Trucking Association all the way through that in America, logistics is the new manufacturing because even some of the biggest manufacturing companies, they just source componentry from all over the world and then they assemble it here with American workers and American machinery, paying American taxes, but they have to pay tariffs on every little component that goes into that
That's right.
built America, buy America product, right? And so they actually changed some of the equations to say what I think 60+% of the ingredients, if you will, needs to be from the US to be BABA compliant. But that's the first part, right? Is there's a lot of companies that support build America, buy America because they're an American company, but they get all their stuff from some other country that's subject to tariff.
No, that's absolutely right. The intermediate goods is a huge part of the equation here. Again, it's not just the imported product, but it's for those U.S. manufacturers relying on those intermediate goods, raw materials, what have you, that are then taking those products for export, which is so critical. And the other part here that people aren't talking enough about is what happens when we put a tariff on somebody else, the retaliation
Mhm.
that comes along. We've heard about the threats of Canada and Mexico and retaliation, and China's going ahead and move forwards with retaliation. And it's not just imports on our tariffs on our exports, but taking a look at other measures as well. Targeting specific companies in country. So it's a big challenge when we get into some of these issues.
Yeah. The other thing I feel like people don't think about when they think about tariffs is there is elasticity in what people are willing to pay for different products. So if a television is $500 and it goes up to $600, you may lose a certain percentage of consumers, but my guess is that that doesn't really change the game for most people on that type of an item. However, uh, if you need to raise the tariffs commensurate enough to be able to not have the U.S. made product become so much more expensive than the foreign made product, it may double the price because we have higher wage standards, we have higher environmental standards, we have development standards, we have to build factories, retool factories, do all these things that are major one-time infrastructure costs. I bring all this up because that's the part people forget about tariffs as well, is if you're using it as a revenue tool for the government, I guess there's an argument to be made for that. But if you're doing it to repatriate manufacturing, I think there's not a person in this country who would say, I wish this was built in America by an American worker. I think that you have that sense. But how much more am I willing to pay to have a countryman build it versus import it from another country? And also, how many jobs are created being part of the modern manufacturing that is logistics, moving things into a port, moving things out of a port, moving things into a warehouse, assembling something, distributing those goods, delivering it to stores and homes. Those are all jobs that fundamentally you will augment many of them, especially the ones that are reliant on international trade. So it's again as closer to a zero sum game, I would guess, from your perspective, more so than put the tariff in place and now we're just going to build it here.
Yeah, I mean, look, tariffs are, play an important. They're an important tool in the toolbox when we talk about trade policy. There are certainly plenty of challenges out there that we have with our friends and allies and trading partners. But we got to use tariffs in a strategic manner. Got to make sure they're focused and really kind of go after whatever the issue is and not look at these broad based tariffs that really kind of miss the goal at the end of the day. Um, but again, we got to take a look at what is the end goal we're trying to achieve with the tariffs. If we want to bring things back here and make stuff back here, that's great. But let's focus on what are those key industries that we want to bring back and we really want to focus on. And it's not just bringing them back, but we've got to focus on, do we have the infrastructure to make that happen? How long is it going to take to get a factory built? Do we have the skilled workforce to be able to do that? We're not talking about bringing jobs back here like we had back in the 1950s. It's not people sitting on the line turning a bolt or what have you. A lot of these are going to be highly technical, highly automated jobs. So what are we doing to upskill our workers to make sure they can handle kind of these new roles that they're going to have? Because again, we can't go back to that 1950s mentality. That's just not how manufacturing works
You
these days. And
you
for
don't want
and
to
for all
mine
those
coal?
people that say, yeah, seriously. But for all the people who say, we don't make anything here anymore, we do. We are more productive now and do more output than we ever have because of the productivity gains we've had through things like automation and technology. So we are making more now than we ever had with
A-
less people.
And even if you look at it, I would argue that with e-commerce and direct to consumer marketplaces, it's reinvigorated the local economy,
Right.
the craftsman economy, people making custom furniture and things that you couldn't do before because you had a captive audience. Whoever could drive to and from your storefront is who your audience was. Well, now you have a global audience, and you can become a market maker in your own type of like I said, crafted manufacturing. And so, yeah, are we building these super long assembly lines every day to build all kinds of mass manufactured projects or products, I should say? Not necessarily. That's I think a vision down the road some people have. But you have more people today through the gig economy building small businesses, and it's not just a service, they're building goods and products as well. And you're seeing some of the fastest growing companies are American manufacturers that are making things here, right? But it's different because you're not trying to produce millions of SKUs at scale. You're producing some bespoke item that people are willing to pay a little bit more for typically.
Yeah, and you've also got to take a look too. Is unfortunately, we can't just kind of close our doors and just make everything here and be self sufficient. You've got to get there are certain things we just don't make here. We don't have available here.
You,
But
you
you
don't
take a
want you
look.
don't like the isolationist policies of
Well,
Woodrow Wilson?
look, you take a look at what happened during the pandemic, and as much as folks faulted the challenge in the supply chain, to the end of the day, the supply chain worked. Because of the global supply chain, we're able to keep things moving. Yeah, things broke down all across the board, but look what happened with baby formula. The crisis we had with baby formula. That was caused because we make 97% of our baby formula is made here in the United States for a variety of reasons. We had one factory that went down that took out 30% of the supply of baby formula. How do we resolve that crisis? We had to get Congress to pass legislation to drop tariffs on European baby formula to bring that in to help, make up the difference. So because of
Yep.
imports, we helped solve that crisis. Once the crisis was over, we put the tariffs back up, but still, reducing tariffs helped us eliminate that crisis and, made families a lot feel a lot better because they can get baby formula for their kids.
Yeah, you talk about the phenomena that's globalization, right? And this is now 40 years in the making, globalization. If you think about the way we know it today, right? This really started in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, the 80s consumer economy meant we needed more things and we wanted to buy more things and they wanted cheaper versions of it. But you can't undo 40 years of something overnight. And I bring this up because what I find to be so interesting is in the first administration, and even in the last 4 years, running for a second bite at the apple, um, there was never an acknowledgement that tariffs increase the cost of consumer goods. However, recently, the administration has unequivocally said there are going to be short-term pains, but long-term you'll thank us, right? And I think most people are very immediate, instant gratification, and they're looking at what's the cost of something today. Um, Talk a little bit about what does that time frame for a tomorrow? And I know I'm asking you to do something that's not exact. There's no
Yeah, it,
modeling that you can point to, but undoing something that's taken 40 years, like how deep do those cuts have to be for the American consumer, and I should say how hard does that pain have to be? Because cuts is got a different connotation when you're talking money. So how hard does that pain have to be in the immediacy to get a turnaround that we'll even see in the lifetimes of even you and myself?
I I think it's a bit of a challenge. I mean, look, for many companies, they are trying to plan and prepare for potential tariffs coming into place. I mean, they have been since last year, throughout the campaign, trying to model out and figure out what's the impact, what can we do, can we shift sourcing, but that all takes time, and it's not something easy that you can do. And putting the tariffs into place immediately is a challenge for these companies who made their buying decisions 6, 9, 12 months ago, where all of a sudden it's like I now have to try and figure out how can I minimize the impact not just to myself but to my consumer as well. And I think folks need to understand that the tariff impact won't be immediate. It's going to depend upon each company, what their mitigation plans are, and really will depend upon the type of product too, because products are going to have to cycle through their inventory. So even though the China tariffs went into effect yesterday, it might be a few weeks or a few months before you start to see potential price increases. Again, it depends upon the retailer, what their mitigation is, and all that. But to try and plan for that is incredibly complex. And the challenge too is kind of the on again, off again nature that we keep seeing in the tariffs and the constant threats. For folks to try and plan, it's like will it or won't it? Just trying to get their heads around it is a bit of a challenge.
Well, and some people have already planned for it, right? Like behind me behind this wall is a warehouse filled with solar panels and coiled metals and all kinds of stuff that they've already been through this. They know
Yeah,
for a fact that they are going to be yet another target in another round of tariffs. If they have figured out different sourcing, now the new country of origin may be at target. There's a lot that
right.
folks are trying to figure out. So as we saw in 2018, a lot of inventory got front loaded before tariffs kicked in. Companies got ahead of it this time. So if you look at it, last year was a very interesting supply chain market because there were points in time where your traditional member, the storefront retailer, the e-commerce retailer we all think about, dipped in their volumes a little bit.
Hmm.
But the raw materials folks and the folks that knew they were going to be targeted, they ramped it up. And then towards the end of the year, a little bit more consumer confidence, tremendous holiday season again, and then you end up with a very, very busy Q4 for everybody. But that's something that I'm looking at, that we're looking at. I know everybody in the supply chain is looking at is what do volumes look like in the first half of this year? Because some of the folks that are going to be impacted just front loaded and said, I'll deal with it this way, as opposed to see what's instituted once there's a new president in office.
Yeah, but there's only so much you can front load, because again, just the uncertainty and front loading costs money as well. Trying to find the
Hmm.
additional warehouse space and the transportation costs and everything else, so that comes at a cost too. And I think folks want to avoid the situation we got to during the pandemic, where they brought in too much inventory in advance, trying to make up for things. You noted that we had more time last go around when the China 301 tariffs were put in place. I mean, you have the investigation, you got to run through the lists and try and get off the list and all that. I mean, that was months and months and months. Here, we had 3 days' notice when the Mexico, Canada, and China tariffs went into effect, and then they were pulled off, hours before they were going to take effect. So, again, that
Like
kind of
TikTok all over again.
yeah, it's that chaos of trying to stay on top of it and plan accordingly. And do I act now or do I wait until the last minute to know this is actually going to happen? Um, it's a challenge. And then we saw, last night, one of the direct results was the elimination of being able to use de minimis for products coming out of China. Last night we got notice from the U.S. Postal Service saying they weren't going to accept any more mail or parcel packages from China or Hong Kong. So that shut that off. And all of a sudden this morning they said, it's back on. And we're now working with customs to figure out a way to kind of handle all this. So, that has an immediate impact on folks.
Yeah, and you bring up an important follow-up question. Before we get to it, I want to remind everybody this is On the Waterfront, brought to you by Waterfront Logistics, here to service all your trucking, transportation, warehousing, and storage needs. If you need anything, you know how to get a hold of me. But John, you bring up the fact that the rules, they're proposed. You think they're going to affect, they get pulled back. You get little notification. It becomes very, very difficult to do this type of planning. I'm asking again. I like to see where do you think things are going in the future. If we're sitting here in December and we're looking back, I'm sure that some of this is looked at as a negotiating tactic, right? Like I don't think there's a real desire personally to go to a trade war with Canada and Mexico. It's they're too strategic of a partner. But I get the theory or the strategy of we want help on these specific issues, really border related. You need to help us secure the border, and then we'll let goods come in and out. We just don't want people and drugs, right? And I know you were going to touch on that a little bit. Let's just several months in the future, looking back, how much of this do you think is going to come and go without any implementation versus how much of this do you think goes into effect and it's going to be here to stay? Because I do believe that once it's in effect, it's harder to undo it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And no, that's absolutely correct. Once tariffs go into effect, it's very difficult to get them pulled off, especially, as the money starts
It's any
coming
kind of
in, you start
tax.
using that money, to pay for other things. It's really tough to say at this point, will they go into effect? I think, look, the Canada and Mexico tariffs are now on hold for 30 days from the ongoing discussions. I think those discussions are going to be ongoing for quite a while because the other part we have here, it's not just the border related issues, and I know that's what this administration wants to make it about, but we also have a USMCA review in 2026. So that I think is part of this discussion as well. Is what is it that the U.S. wants as part of the USMCA review, which, oh, by the way, this president negotiated. So, what elements of that agreement do they want to see updated or improved? I think that all kind of lends into this whole discussion. But again, I think if we're talking about trying to address the border related issues, the immigration, the fentanyl issues, uh, using tariffs as a blunt instrument to try and make changes on that, I don't know if that's the right approach to take. I think just having the conversations with Canada and Mexico, get to the table and have that among our closest and best allies, probably should have been kind of the first go around, as opposed to a threat of a trade war.
You you can always have it there, right? You can always
Right.
say, here are tariffs. And if we can't get some productive conversations around issues that are important to us, vis-a-vis immigration, border security, influx of drugs, illegal illicit drugs coming into the country, then we will look at tariffs as a way to measure it. You typically don't hit somebody with the hammer and then say, "Are you ready to negotiate?" But what do I know, right? That's not my forte. I'm not in that role, right? So um, I bring this up because I have two questions left. And second to last question would be: we've had 4 years of a Trump administration. I think, depending on your political beliefs and your socioeconomic status and a whole bunch of things, you may have a different experience as to how you look at um, 2016 to 2020, right? What are we seeing right now that seems consistent? Because it's interesting. This the second president who's had staggered terms, not non-consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland, I believe, was the other one. Um, what is consistent with the 35th presidential administration, or 45th, I mean, presidential administration, versus the 47th version of this administration? Outside of people and whatnot, when we're talking about trade policy, what have you seen consistent, and what have you seen augmented and or maybe adapted to what we've seen as the outcome? He has the benefit of seeing the outcome of policies and how they impacted his successor slash predecessor's administration.
I mean, look, I think the consistent thing is that President Trump has been consistent all along on his thoughts on trade and tariffs. From when he ran prior to 2016 through his 2016 presidency to now, he has always been talked about trade and talked about tariffs as being a good tool. He's constantly talked about the U.S. losing and being taken advantage of, and wanting to get the best deal for Americans. I mean, I think that has been consistent that he has always talked about. Look, we want him to be successful. We want to make sure that we have the best economy, that we're thriving, that we benefit our workers and our consumers. We just got to make sure that we have policies in place that help us to be able to do that. We can remain competitive in a global marketplace. There are opportunities when you look at the America First Trade memo that he put out, on the 20th, the executive order he signed. That is a roadmap for his thinking on trade, and we know there could be lots of other investigations into lots of other trade related issues, but there's also opportunity in there where he talks about, can we look at trade negotiations to open markets with our friends, make opportunities for our exporters. Are there sectoral agreements we can be taking a look at? Are there new and updated things we can do with current free trade agreements? We welcome that. We had none of that during the Biden administration, during the last administration. There was no focus on getting ourselves back on the playing field when it comes to trade negotiations.
It was kind of
There's an
status quo from whatever was implemented
It wasn't
under the
even a status
45th.
quo. It wasn't even a status quo. It was a complete shift of, this worker-centered trade policy that I think folks are still trying to figure out, what that was. We had these big frameworks we were working on, the IPEF and APEF, but there was nothing substantial there that helped to actually open markets for U.S. exports. So we hope that's the
Meanwhile, the
opportunity.
tariffs stayed in place, is what I was trying
Correct.
to allude
Well,
to. There was
not
no
only did they
shift or change of
no,
policy. They just left them in place and said, we've got our
not
own agenda.
not only did they stay in place, they actually raised them before the end of the presidency when they did their 4-year review, on certain key categories, and they eliminated majority of the exclusions that had been there previously. The exclusion process is all but gone right now. There's only a handful of exclusions that remain, and that's something we hope, if tariffs do move forwards under this administration, we hope there's an opportunity to reinvigorate that exclusions process, because there's plenty of opportunity for those companies, again, that don't make product here, that's not available here. They're going to get hit with these tariffs. As you noted, the inputs to production, the intermediate goods, the critical minerals. If that stuff's not made here, we got to figure out why are we going to put a tariff on that if it can't be brought back here. So, we've got to make sure we've got some kind of exclusions process in place to be able to address some of those other inequities that are going to hurt, U.S. businesses and U.S. customers, U.S. consumers.
Sounds like it's an absolutely terrifying issue for your members, pun intended. Bad dad joke, but I'm full of
Yeah.
those these days. Um, what I'd like to finish up, and I feel like I'd love to bring you back in a couple months and take a look at some of the four. I love the numbers you guys do, and quite frankly, they're always spot on, at least from a trend perspective. If anything, usually you outperform the forecast. So I feel like you guys do an amazing job of letting people know what to expect in your represented segment of the economy. But what are people not talking about? Whether it's this issue, it could be on security issues. Like, what are people not talking about that they should be from a policy perspective that's really going to make consumers think twice about how they are interacting with some of their favorite and beloved brands?
I mean, look, there's a lot that's on the table here that policy wise that Congress is going to be working on. I noted the tax reform bill. That is a huge piece of this that can take up a lot of time in Congress that we are spending a lot of time working on as well, because we want to see those tax reforms stay in place, especially the tax cut that our folks got. Moving from 35 to 21% certainly helped them not only just deal with the tariffs that were in place in 2018, but a lot of that got them through the pandemic as well. Being able to have that cash and be able to make some changes and do some things and stay afloat was really, really important. So that tax thing is a real big priority for us. Looking at labor issues, privacy issues, AI is another huge area that retail is, really lending a lot onto right now, leaning on for a variety of issues throughout the retail organization. Certainly is a priority. So there are lots of issues that are, in the forefront for Congress, and that this administration is going to be working on. So we're waiting to get the right folks in place at the agencies and the departments, and really start moving forwards on the agenda and see how we can kind of make sure that we help this economy continue to move forward. We want to work close with the administration, and again, want to make sure we're all successful at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I would just say to the listeners out there, many of which are in the industry in one way, shape, or form, it's just important to get engaged with your trade associations. I think what's very unique is whether you're a trucker who belongs to the Harbor Trucking Association or the CTA or the American Trucking Association, or whether you're a retailer who belongs to the NRF and RELA or all points in between. There's a lot of collaboration between the folks that own the products, the beneficial cargo owners who are importing them, and then all of the service vendors and intermediaries that help get them to the consumer through the various different avenues, whether that be brick and mortar stores or direct to consumer home deliveries. And so it's important to stay educated, and I think now more than ever, because typical government, you have some theoretical shifts, but it's still government. This is different than I think anybody has ever dealt with, in the sense that, again, you've got business people running government and trying to align it more with the principles of how you run a business. But it's really hard to take you know close to 250 years now of bureaucratic infrastructure and undo it and recreate it. And so, I think that there's this impatientness from people that want reform, then they want massive reform, and they want to see it tomorrow. But it's not really possible. And I think it's critical to get educated on the correlating effects between what the decisions are and what the impacts could be, because a lot of times the good ideas, they may actually be good, but you and your lifetime, again, may not see the impact of the good. It may be really terrible for you. And so balancing this and trying to get to a better future that doesn't completely corrupt the now is going to be, I think, the most crucial thing to this administration. And when we look back in 10 years, it's going to be one of the hallmarks of whether or not it was a successful administration, is what happens in the next decade after this administration leaves office, and what are the impacts of these policies? Because when you start scaling things down, it's again not as easy to just build up that infrastructure again if you're wholesale tearing down departments and changing things. So I think the next 4 years are going to be critical for the future of this nation. And I'm not here to say good, bad, or indifferent. I just think people need to get educated to understand how this shift away from traditional bureaucratic government policy is going to impact them in their both personal lives and their professional lives. Because if you're not doing well, it's really hard to do good, as they say.
Yeah, and Weston, to that point, it's not only important to educate yourselves, but it's important for you to educate others as well. So, really important for folks to educate their elected officials on what this all means for them, what the impacts are going to be on your business, on your workers, and your employees, or and your customers. So, whether it's at the local level, the federal level, you guys can tell the story on how what this all means for you at the end of the day. So, I would encourage folks. Look, we can do everything we can here from DC, but elected officials love to talk to their constituents and want to know what this all means for them. So you don't have to come to DC to do the advocacy. When you're back home, invite them into your sites, invite them into your warehouses, invite them into your whatever you operate, and explain to them this is what we do. This is what these policies mean for me as a business, for my workers, and for those who we serve as customers. So I think it's really important that elected officials all up and down the line, the local, state, and federal, hear from folks what these policies mean and what it means for you going forwards, and how you guys can engage and do some of that work too.
Yeah, I love that message. I love to wrap things up on some sort of call to action, and you beat me to. I didn't even need to say final words for the audience. So I really appreciate that, John. It's like we've done this before. But I really appreciate your time today. I couldn't agree with you more. Everybody's got to take the time to educate their policymakers, make it local, understand how it impacts the people
Absolutely.
that they represent, not just from a global perspective, what are the impacts, but locally, what's the trickle down effect? And like I said, would love to have you on in a few months again to kind of do this as an ongoing check-in, because let's just be honest, like you have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the biggest industry that impacts consumer behavior. And that consumer behavior then really is the telltale for everything we need to look at from an economic perspective. So appreciate you coming on, John. You have your hands full. That's for sure. And we're here to support you in any way we can here from our little corner of the country, trying to move some containers in and out of the nation's ports. So again, thank you for joining us and really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Weston. Appreciate it.
Thanks. To our listeners out there, again, thank you for joining us. We had John Gold, our very first guest for the On the Waterfront podcast, brought to you by Waterfront Logistics. We hope that you'll join us again next time when we'll have Mike Robinson, former executive vice president of e-commerce and Macy's.com, who is now venturing off into the wild world of sustainability, which there's a whole host of other policy related issues we can talk about when we talk about green supply chains and the cataclysmic shift from the last administration versus the new administration vis-a-vis green technology in the nation's supply chain. So for that, I'm Weston LaBar signing off. This was On the Waterfront. We'll see you next time.